Good morning. Today we will look at Job chapters 8, 9, and 10. And chapter 8 begins with Bildad speaking to Job, telling him that he should repent. And he starts with the words of your mouth like a strong wind, and in chapter 6, verse 26, the end of it, Job had said, our speeches of a desperate one, which are as wind. And in many ways, Bildad is saying to Job here that, you're full of hot air. You're just, you're right. All your words are like a mighty wind. They're just nothing, and you're full of a lot of hot air. And we know that's not a compliment. And he says, if you would take God earnestly, and if you were pure and upright, none of this would have happened, he's just pointing his fingers at Job and twisting Job's words around and saying, none of this would have happened if you, your sons, your daughters, if you weren't guilty of some terrible sin. And that was so prevalent in their attitudes and their beliefs, that bad things happen to bad people, and we know that in today's world, bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people and all of that in between there. And Bildad says, inquire of the former age and consider things discovered. We weren't born yesterday, and because our days are a shadow, they teach you and they utter words from the heart. And it's just, he's not offering sympathy and comfort. He's trying to find fault. He's trying to point out that all of this is, wrong, and it's got to be something that they did, And in chapter 9, Job answers, and he says, how can a man be righteous before God? If one wishes to contend, he could answer 1,000 and 1,000. God is wise in heart and mind and strength. And why has he hardened himself and prospered? He removes mountains. I don't know it. He's talking about the magnificence of God, the righteousness of God, the purity of God, and that first line there, in verse 2, it's how can a man be righteous before God? How can a man live a life that is favorable to God, satisfactory to God? How can a man live a life? He understands that, but yet, he hasn't done anything terribly wrong that all of this should befall him, and he talks about, God. He says he seals off the stars. He alone spreads out the heavens. He treads on the waves of the sea, and he made the Bear, the Orion, the Pleiades, talking about all the stars and the constellations in the sky. And he did all of those things. And he said, yes, he did wonders without number. And then, in verse 12, he says, if he takes it away, who can hinder him? Who can say to him, what are you doing? God will not withdraw his anger to the allies who lie proud and prostrate before him. And then it's, how can I answer him? How can I answer him and choose my words to reason with him? For though I was righteous, I could not answer him. I could not beg judge them, and he's pleading his case in so many ways, and stating that there isn't anything in his life or that he knows of in his children's lives. That was it started out that Job would pray for his children and and the forgiveness that would come to them in case they had done something wrong when they gathered together for meals and stuff. And in verse 21, Job says, I am blameless, yet I do not know myself. I despise my life. It's one thing, and he destroys the blameless with the wicked. And this is something to think about. Job says that God destroys the blameless with the wicked. God doesn't differentiate that way. And God isn't up there pulling the strings and causing everything to happen, but it's, God is up in heaven, and he's not running the earth and all of the people in it like puppets on a string and everything that would go that way. In chapter 10, he starts out, my soul loathes my life. I would give free counsel to my complaint, and then in verse 2, he says, I will say to God, do not condemn me. Show me why you contend with me. What is the charge against me? What have I done wrong? And that's so often, we wonder that too. What have I done wrong? I mean, not that our lives are being plagued with death of our children, loss of all of our properties and cattle, and loss of everything, and then to be covered with sores like Job is. Not very many people anyway have calamities in their lives that way, but Job is, how can I present myself to God, and how can I come against this? That you would despise the work of my hands, that you would spurn me. And in verse 7 he says, although you know that I am not guilty, and there is no one who can deliver me from your hands have made and fashioned me. And so even though, Job is saying, even though that I know that, I'm not perfect, I can't be righteous in your sight, but yet I've done well in my life. He says, remember, I pray that you made me like clay, and will you turn me to dust again? And then in verse 18 and 19, why have you brought me out of the womb that I would perish? No eye had seen me. I would have been as though I had not been. And again, just wishing he had never been born because of all of this that has happened in his life. And, I think we've all been there, trying to figure out, why is this happening? What's going on in life? What can I do differently? And sometimes we have friends that come and try to help. And these 3 friends of Job's, they came meaning well. They sat, with him for quite some time, 7 days. But yet, they're trying to help Job figure out what he did wrong. And they don't hear Job professing that, I don't know. I don't think I did. I don't think any of this is my fault. And I think this is one of the things that all of us need to realize, that, the life isn't my fault. What happens isn't my fault. I mean, we make mistakes and things happen that way, but, life in itself is good and blessed in so many ways, but yet there's always trouble. There's always something going on. And this book of Job, in so many ways, doesn't really help us figure all of that out. And I had a lady tell me one time that, well, there isn't anything in the book of Job that's any good. It's worthless. She couldn't figure out why it's in the Bible. And I think a lot of people agree with that. But if we watch and listen and look in there are some good things in Job, and to know first and foremost that God is righteous, and that God isn't the one inflicting this punishment upon anybody.